All right, so review of Guardians of the Galaxy on PC. First thing being story. Well, the story is definitely the highlight of this game. I mean, there's no question about that. I am not super familiar with the comic book by any means. I've seen both the movies, as I've seen, I think, all the Marvel movies at this point. But I have not a lot of knowledge of the comic books, which I think is what a lot of this is based on. But I can say that the story was interesting enough and good enough that I'm getting interested in the comic books. I think the cast of characters in Guardians of the Galaxy are all very interesting, and they're actually kind of getting me interested in potentially checking out the comic book sometimes, because the movie, when it very first came out, was a surprise. How much I enjoyed it, not knowing really anything about the Guardians before I went in. And the video game, similarly, sort of surprised. I didn't really know whether or not it was going to be a very good game. The Marvel games have not really hit the mark too often. So it was good to see this one actually hit the mark and actually be a really good game. So that was nice. Definitely excited to see whether or not they can make this a trend, whether they can make a couple of good games. But focusing on this one for the time being, the storyline was really good. You know, we kind of commented on it earlier in the finale stream here about how the character interaction was really good. You know, the interaction between the party members, you know, between the different members of the Guardians of the Galaxy was really well done, and well done than some RPGs I've played that is a bigger focus of the game. You know, like, you put it, you know, you think of like what are the great like party interaction RPGs of the modern era, you know, Dragon Age Origins and things like that. I think this one did a really good job. You know, I thought it was, especially for what it was, right? Because it wasn't an RPG game as a focus where you spend a whole lot of time delving into characters like side stories and having like lengthy conversations around the campfire a la Dragon Age or something like that. This one just kind of offered you little tidbits between missions where you could talk to people, and then you could discover like items that would unlock sort of more interesting side conversations. And then there was some decent little interactions in the midst of some of the missions in individual moments. But they managed to make all that work really well for them. You know, they gave you a good amount of information. I found myself just more intrigued by the characters and their sort of individual backgrounds through those interactions. And I just wanted more of it. So, I mean, I'd say they hit the nail on the head with that aspect of it. As far as the main storyline goes, with the Church of, you know, the Promise and all that stuff, and the church guys, and getting to go to like interesting locales like Nowhere and a couple of different planets and fight some really big beasties and all that kind of stuff. I felt like they did a really good job with that as well. I mean, I feel like the original Guardians of the Galaxy movie, again, not having really read the comic books, I feel like the Guardians movie like laid a similar sort of groundwork that was intriguing about this, you know, kind of ragtag group of people that go around the galaxy and interact with all these different interesting characters and different locations. And I feel like the video game here did basically the same thing. You know, it gave you all this sort of interesting stuff to dabble in and bounce you off a bunch of interesting characters, some of which are larger than the Guardians of the Galaxies themselves. They're, you know, not superheroes per se. They're sort of like workman type heroes, which is, I think, what makes them appealing, because you can sort of relate to them. And they kind of bounce around in the company of beings that are much more powerful and much more galactic than they are. But they still hold their own in that company, which is, I think, an interesting aspect of Guardians of the Galaxy in general. And I feel like the game hits all that just like the movie did, and I'm sure obviously the comic books probably do. Unfortunately, I think one of the more also interesting aspects that I love about Guardians is the musical aspect, because I'm a big fan of like 80s rock and that whole 80s vibe that the Guardians really operate within. But because I had to play it on Twitch and I had to stream it and we have DMCA, I didn't get to really interact with the musical side of it as much. I mean, they did have some original tracks that were really good. I mean, they fit the vibe well, but there's a lot of music we didn't get to interact with, which is sort of unfortunate. It's just a product of the times we live in, but I think if we had had the ability to interact with all the music, it probably would have added a nice touch to it, but unfortunately we didn't get to do that. So we can't really dock it points for that. Although what I will say is I will give it bonus points because it does have a streamer mode, which automatically strips out all that music, which is something that we did not have with Back for Blood, which was very frustrating because the devs acknowledged that we might get copyright striked for having the music in the game, but did not offer a way to remove that music. So kudos to IDOS for putting that option in there so we didn't get the DMCA. But unfortunately, we didn't get to interact with it. I'm not really remembering any moments of story that kind of like that bothered me. Like, you know, sometimes in stories there's like the individual section or something like that you don't really care for. I brought up like Dragon Age Origins as a comparison with the party thing. You know, like Dragon Age Origins, when you get to the dwarven part of the story, I never liked that part that much. I always think that part's kind of a drag, you know, so I don't like going through the dwarven section every time I play Dragon Age Origins. Just as an example. But this game didn't really have a section that really stood out as like, I don't really like this section. All the sections were good. There were some gameplay elements that got a little repetitive, though that doesn't really factor into the story. But all the locations were interesting. All the sections were good. They threw in good amounts of story. They kept the pace of the game moving at a good rate without being like too brisk or too slow. Nothing felt sort of irrelevant that you were doing. And they even threw in some curveballs all the way up until the very end of the game, where you had the bonus fight at the end that I won't talk about what it was for, you know, spoiler benefits if anybody might be watching that hasn't played the game. But it did a good job, I think, consistently all throughout the game with all those different elements. So I got to give a game full credit for that. I think it did a fantastic job. So getting all kind of down to it and kind of tying it all together, I think I would probably give the story a pretty solid like 9 out of 10. You know, it was solid all the way around. I don't think that there's anything that stands out as like a negative per se. Again, I can't relate it to the comics. I can't say how faithful it is or whatever, but it seems like it's probably pretty faithful. I get the vibe that it was. But I don't know. Maybe I'll look up some information afterwards now that I've beaten the game to kind of see if anybody that's a huge comic book fan had like some big objection to anything that was in the game. It seemed like there was a lot of nods to the comic book community and the long-term fans. It seemed like there was a lot of, you know, attempts to cater to those people. But also there was a decent amount of catering to people who are fans of the movies, and maybe that's all the interaction they've ever had with the Guardians, like myself. There were some good nods in there for that. So I feel like they probably were pretty good, but, you know, you never know. There could be like easy ways to like infuriate the fandom sometimes. But I would definitely give it like a 9 out of 10. I think the story really just didn't have any super obvious faults. It was just solid all the way around. That leaves us to moving on to gameplay. Now, gameplay is where the game is going to suffer a bit. The combat definitely had its issues. Some of the mini game, if you want to call them, mechanics you had to interact with had their issues. Some gameplay elements I think were a bit overused and repetitive, such as, especially toward the end of the game, it seemed like you were sliding down ramps almost all the time. All of a sudden, you were just sliding and sliding and sliding and doing the same kind of slide mini game over and over again. It's not that the sliding, whatever you want to call it, mini game, it was bad, but like, did we really need to do it like 10 times in an hour? You know, like it seemed like it just sort of got overused there. It seemed like it became this like sort of filler mechanic. Some other aspects were like kind of not fully realized as well in the mini game things, like the little bit of space battling you did was kind of a little bit wonky. There was a sequence coming into the planet where you go to fight Fing Fang Foom, where you're sort of crash landing, and that was like very awkward. It was, I don't know, it was very like oddly done controls and stuff like that. Like there's just like a couple of moments for sure that things just like didn't quite come together. It felt like it wasn't that well programmed and conceived. And then the combat itself was not completely awful, but like it had some like sort of like wonky design. One of which was the countering system, where the enemies would sometimes counter you. I didn't really understand like what relevance that played, because landing the counter and hitting the correct button didn't really gain you any kind of bonus. All it did was kind of hurt you if you failed, and it was sort of oddly placed because in order to do the melee combat, you had to sort of spam the button to do repeated hit combos, and then they would all of a sudden throw a button prompt in the middle of that and go, oh, here, hit this completely other button. It was always just like, it just didn't flow very well. Like it didn't seem like it really belonged there. Just kind of felt like some odd little punishing mechanic that didn't play into anything really that well. I didn't really care for that. Also, the fact that the lock-on was really bad. Like, objectively, the lock-on mechanic, really bad in this game. By default, it didn't even switch you targets after you killed the first one, which is an odd choice. There was no sticky targeting whatsoever, so you couldn't just, like, hit a button and then lock onto a target and then just kind of hold fire and have it just kind of bounce around and keep the target. You had to hold the button down the whole time in order to maintain the targeting, which is another sort of odd choice. And then the way that the controller keybinds were set up was a little weird as well, because your left trigger was lock on, your right trigger is fire, or your basic attack, and then your left bumper is to pull up your party mechanic to target your party members. So in order to target a party member ability, you had to let go of lock on, which always felt very awkward. Like, that didn't feel any less awkward as the game went on due to the lack of sticky targeting. So it was like unlock from your target and then try to relock to a target with a team member ability. It was just like an odd transition. Like, why not just have the targeting be sticky, and then when I take my hand off the targeting button, it doesn't really matter because I'm already locked on to the target I intended to use the ability on. It always caused this sort of like jankiness feeling where it was like you lose your target and then you try to quickly reacquire it to use your party member ability. I don't really know why they went with that. It never felt good to take your hand off of target, and it never felt good to have your hand on target the whole time. So like that whole system of that was like not great. And it caused a lot of like messy fight moments. Also, the animations and the interactions with some of those abilities could be buggy at times. Animations would look off. Characters would sort of fly off the screen. They wouldn't trigger their ability properly. Some of the teamwork abilities as well, especially, could look very wonky at times. There's a lot going on with having this many characters and that much stuff going on the screen. So I can kind of get why it's tough to nail all that stuff, but it happened often enough that it was noticeable. So I feel like it has to be brought up. You know, like this was a game design decision they made, and for the most part they nailed it. But like there's definitely like wonkiness and issues and a sort of a not quite totally AAA kind of quality to some of those aspects. It needed like a little bit of more iteration and a little more polishing, I would say. Um, Same thing, like I say, would be said about the targeting and all that kind of stuff. So the combat is, it's sort of interesting the way the combat comes together in this game, because like it's frustrating in how it has like these flaws, because like the combat is like very nearly really, really good. You know, like having the different team members and the different abilities and unlocking more of those abilities and doing the combos where you know, like you'd root everything with Groot and then you drop a big grenade on it with Rocket, and then you'd have, you know, Drax fucking fly in, and you know, like that was a cool concept. Like it worked pretty well in that sense. It's just trying to trigger all that and get all that to interact correctly, and the way that the controller keybinds were set up sort of let that down, which is sort of unfortunate, because if they'd have just had some sticky targeting, the animations had just flowed a little bit smoother, and thus using the abilities would have been a little bit less janky, the combat would have been way better. But because of these other decisions that impacted the combat, it never really kind of comes together and flows how you want it to. So the whole game combat feels just like a little, it just feels like off. It just feels janky, which is sort of unfortunate, because like I say, it feels like it's like right there. It's like it's very nearly really good combat, because most everything else I feel like works pretty well. You know, the way the active reload on the gun is, the sort of strengths and weaknesses of the different enemy types you fight, which it's worth noting that there's a good variety of enemy types. Some games don't really offer much variety. This one I felt had a pretty good variety. I mean, they did repeat enemies over and over again at times, but they were repeated in ways that felt relevant to the place where they were placed. And it wasn't like excessive where you were just like, oh my god, yet again, we're fighting this thing. Like, you'd go through a section and fight a bunch of the same type of enemy because it was relevant to that section. And then they would kind of make a couple of reappearances later on, but not nearly as bad as many games I've played where you just see the same enemy type, maybe a different color over and over again. Like, nothing quite as egregious as that. So they did a pretty good job there. The boss fights, like the big ones especially, a little bit hit and miss. They tried to do something as far as like doing something kind of big, you know, larger scale with some of the boss fights. Fing Fang Foom is sort of a good example. They tried to do this like big epic battle, like something right out of like World of Warcraft or Guild Wars or something like that, with the big dragon. And while it sort of like functionally did work, it also was not super interactive at the end of the day. Like, you just kind of keep shooting at his feet and like melting the ice off, and then you just kind of dodge around a whole bunch until eventually a interaction triggers without any kind of really rhyme or reason to it. It just kind of like decides, okay, now you can do the thing, and you hit the button, and then he gets stunned, and you just like dump damage on him, and then he goes back to, you know, doing his like rotation again. So some of the interactions with like these bigger boss fights, they just really didn't, you know, there wasn't really anything like there, you know, like it felt like there should have been more interaction between what I'm doing and the boss, rather than just sort of waiting for the right prompt to appear and then hitting the button. Other than that, you mostly just kind of dodge, or like in the earlier fight against the tentacle Cthulhu monster and Lady Hellbender's palace, or whatever you want to call it, you mostly just slayed little minions in waves and waves and waves and waves and waited for the interaction to pop up. So I felt like they didn't quite nail those either, which is kind of a shame, because again, like the minion variety of regular guys that you fought were not bad. You know, I felt like those worked pretty well. So I'm not sure why the bosses themselves didn't quite nail it as well as the minions did. They didn't scale up quite entirely perfectly. It wasn't bad, it just wasn't great. It was just kind of average, I guess, is really what it comes down to. It's just kind of average. Another thing I feel like I want to mention just sort of briefly is the power-up system. there was two different like sort of ways to increase your party strength. One was to unlock new abilities, which you unlocked by acquiring essentially experience. That worked pretty well. I thought that was, like that had meaningful choices and they were fun new abilities to use, and there's no real huge complaints about that. The other way was by collecting resources throughout the missions and then going to a workbench where you could upgrade your abilities a little bit. This one I feel like worked less successfully. I mean, the abilities you got were functional and they were there, but most of them were just kind of like passives. They weren't super interactive, and then it didn't feel like there was enough of them. And you never gained like more as time went on. So if you were a fairly diligent explorer like I was, you ended up acquiring way more resources than you needed to get all the abilities. I had all the abilities unlocked well before the end of the game. And I kept anticipating that there would be like another unlock of abilities or something like that, but it never really came. It was just kind of like, well, these are the 15 abilities you have, and this is all you're ever going to get. And most of them are sort of like passives, like give you more health, give you more shield, regenerate shields faster. There was one for sucking in items from further away. Like, most of them were not very exciting. They were just sort of like their abilities that, had their uses, but there was nothing particularly interesting about most of them. So I felt like that system kind of just didn't quite nail it as much as the other ones did. But it is what it is. It's just like I was a little bit disappointed by that particular system. So kind of wrapping all that together, I think that's pretty much everything I want to touch on. So we gave the story a 9. I feel like the gameplay is like, with the somewhat wonky controls and some of the glitchiness and some of the sections not quite being as polished as some of the others. I feel like this is where the game kind of takes a bit of a dip. And I would probably give it like a 7.5 on the gameplay, which for me is not like, it's not to say that it's like garbage. It's just like a 7. It's just like, average. It's just like, it's solid. It's there. It's usable. It doesn't prohibit you from playing the game in any kind of major way. I think we only had one crash. We had a couple of somewhat wonky bugs here and there in terms of like getting stuck in terrain. But they did have a pretty good unstuck, what you would call it, unstuck kind of AI to it, where it would recognize that you were stuck after about 15 seconds or so and would move you back into a position where you were no longer stuck. Which was nice, because that means we never had to like reload or lose progress over getting stuck. Even though that did happen several times, we never had to lose gameplay progress for it. So that was nice. We had a couple of like sort of glitchy sort of things in combat where we get stuck and we die or whatever. So we did lose like a little bit of progress to some things like that, but it wasn't too bad, to be honest. And I played on the highest difficulty. As I usually do with games. So it was like a tiny, I guess you could say a bit harder than it might be for some other people. So like those glitches could kill me at times, but I didn't really even feel like the difficulty was too bad. Even for being on max difficulty, there was only a few moments where things got like really, really difficult, and it was mostly because of just so many enemies. And the thing that made those moments actually hard was like the targeting and the interaction with like your hero abilities and stuff like that I mentioned earlier that were a problem. That was mainly what made those moments hard. Not so much the game difficulty, but just the tackling the controls and the interaction with the game with those controls. So if that stuff had been ironed out a little bit better, I think that those sections wouldn't even been as bad as they were. So yeah, I think like a 7.5 on the gameplay. It's definitely the worst part of the game, but it, like I say, it doesn't prevent you from playing the game. It doesn't. I wouldn't say don't play the game because of this. Like, it's nothing that severe. It's just there's a lot of it that sort of piles up, that just sort of like, it gives you a feeling not of like the game's unplayable. It just gives you this feeling of like, you know, if they had just done like a little bit better of a job, this could have been like an 8 or a 9. It could have been so good, but they just fall a bit short. And hopefully they can improve upon that if they get a chance to do another Guardians game or just another Marvel game of some kind, because I think the formula they have here is good. They just needed to do a little bit better of a job, you know. And maybe it's Square's fault as the publisher. Maybe Square pushed it out and you know, wanted to hit that deadline or something like that. We know that happens. I don't know if it was, you know, IDOS not really doing a good job so much as it might have been Square being like, yo, it's time to push this game out, whether or not you're kind of ready or not. I don't know, but regardless, it falls a little bit short. So that brings us to the overall, which, given the story a 9 and the gameplay a 7, I feel like it sits pretty comfortably for me around an 8. You know, very solid game, above average, especially for the story and the characters and the voice acting and all that stuff. Definitely play it for that. If you're not a person that likes to, if like you get frustrated too easily, or you don't like that kind of difficulty curve, or you're concerned about the control stuff that I mentioned being like a big problem, maybe don't play it on the highest difficulty. Maybe just play it on the regular difficulty, or maybe even easy if there was. I think there was an easy difficulty below it. Maybe just don't play it on the highest difficulty like I did, and maybe those problems won't be as big of a problem because you'll just kind of like breeze through the combat sections easier. But you know, if that's your concern, go ahead and do that. I would say it's perfectly fine, because the biggest thing to enjoy here is the storyline, is the characters, more so than the combat and the moment-to-moment gameplay. So I don't think you'll be too disappointed if you play it for those reasons and lower the difficulty on that. That would probably be my advice. But if you like a little challenge, if you don't mind a little frustration here and there, it's totally playable on the highest difficulty. So yeah, I think that'll be the end of the review. I think that hits all the points that I can think of right now. And it was just a solid game, and it has New Game Plus, so it'd be interesting to kind of see if some of the decisions that you make in the story change anything, because you do get to make some interesting choices here and there, and you do have some interactions that you go through, like, you know, Cosmo shows up near the end of the game and sort of like helps you out, but you could have failed to save Cosmo. Maybe that would have been a big deal. Maybe if you hadn't saved Cosmo, he wouldn't have shown up. I don't know. Kind of interested to see how that stuff may interact with the game. But that'll be the end of this review. Thanks for watching.